Thank you for joining me today. It's Brian Gubernick, and welcome to the No Days Off podcast, where we believe that every single day brings a new opportunity to get better. Today, we are going to talk about risk, how we take risk, when we should take risk, and honestly, how I think most of us might be doing it a little bit wrong. I want to introduce you to a guy that I just learned about earlier today from a buddy of mine out of Austin. His name's Chris Gunn, but the guy I'm talking about that Chris introduced me to, not literally introduced me to, but told me about the guy's concepts. That guy's name is Nido Qubein. Nido Qubein. I did not know anything about Nido before Chris told me about him, but once I started reading, I was fascinated. Let me give you a little bit of Nido's background because I think it matters with respect to what we're going to discuss here today. Nido grew up in Lebanon, and when he was 17 years old, his mother put him on a flight to the United States, a one-way flight all by himself. The kid, 17 years old, gets off the plane. He's got $50 in his pocket, and he speaks virtually no English. That is his starting line. He's in the country, 50 bucks, doesn't speak the language. And then Nido goes on to build one of the most successful professional speaking careers ever. He founds a consulting firm. He helps to start a bank. He ends up on the board of Lazy Boy, where, by the way, he chairs the risk management committee. He becomes executive chairman of the Great Harvest Bread Company. And then in 2005, he takes the job that probably defines him most, which is he becomes the president of High Point University, which is in North Carolina. Now, when Nido took over High Point, it was a small, struggling school. There was probably 1,000 or so freshman applications each year. There was an endowment of somewhere around $42 million. 20 years later, that same school gets about 22,000 freshman applications a year. The endowment is close to $250 million. And Nido has overseen more than $2 billion worth of transformation on that campus. So he went from 50 bucks in his pocket to a $2 billion campus rebuild. I think that is some progress over a career. So when a guy like this starts to talk about risk, I think we've got to pay attention because he's taken all sorts of risks. He's worn many different hats. And I think what he's done, and as I learn more about him, he's developed this incredible framework that he uses to evaluate risk. And I think it is so simple. I really think all of us can incorporate it into our next decision. Maybe a decision that's literally sitting on your desk needing to be made right now. So let's walk through it. Here it is. There are 3 questions that Nido asks, and you ask them in this order. The first one is, what is the best thing that could happen? So the first question, what is the best thing that could happen? This is when you're assessing something that may appear to be risky or a decision that requires risk. What is the best thing that could happen? Second question, what is the most likely thing that could happen? And the third question, what is the worst thing that could happen? What is the worst thing that could happen? That's it. Just 3 questions. But I think this is where Nido is maybe different from most of us. When we evaluate a decision, we spend, I don't know, probably 95% of our time on one question. And it's specifically either question 1, which is what is the best thing that could happen? Or question 3, which is what is the worst thing that can happen? I know when I learned of this, I thought, okay, how do I normally process it? And how I normally process risk in my world, I say, hey, what's the best that could happen? What's the worst that could happen? Question 1 and question 3. So we're either fantasizing about the best case. Maybe we're running our business plan off of best case, or we're hiring off of best case, or signing a big lease off of best case. So we're either fantasizing about best case or we're actually stuck on the worst case. We're afraid of what could go wrong. And as a result, we never pull the trigger on something important or anything at all. What Nido says, though, is you have to have answers to all three of those questions. Really, true, honest answers to all three. But you make the decision off of the middle question, off of question number two, which remember is what is the most likely thing that could happen? So you make the decision off of question two. That's the most likely case because that's the one that's actually going to happen, give or take. And then what you do is you cross check it against the worst case just to make sure you can survive it if it happens to go that way. And you compare it to the best case. Not that you necessarily have to prepare for best case, but it's just for sake of comparison and analysis. So let me put this into what I think is more a more real scenario here. Say you've gone back and forth on whether to fly across the country to meet a potential partner face to face. It's a full day of travel, probably costs a lot. Flights aren't cheap. And there's no guarantee at all that this person even does a deal with you. So you're contemplating whether you should fly across the country to meet a potential partner face to face. And it's a lot to ask because there's no guarantee this person even is right for you or does a deal with you. Now, should you go? Now, if you run this framework, what's the best case? Best case is you fly across the country, you hit it off, you shake hands on something that changes the total trajectory of your year or maybe even your career. Now, what's the most likely case? The most likely case is you build a relationship, you stay on their radar, and something maybe comes from that relationship 6 to 12 months out. And what's the worst case scenario? The meeting goes absolutely nowhere and you've spent a day traveling and you spent money on a plane ticket. Now, the most likely outcome nudges you toward your goal. Your worst case is something that you can absorb. So what do you do in this scenario? You go because your most likely outcome nudges you closer towards your goal. Now let's flip it, okay? Let's use the same framework, but a totally different decision. Say you're thinking about opening a second location for your widget factory. It's a $500,000 build out. You need to sign a lease. You need to staff it up. And you need to do this before location number one is even fully profitable. Okay, so what's the best case? The best case is that both locations crush it. And within a year, you're a major player in the widget space. That's best case. Most likely case is you're split between two spots and you cannot be in both places. So what happens is both of them most likely underperform for the next 18 months. Doesn't mean forever, but the next most likely situation is you're split. Time is limited. And both locations will underperform for a period of time. Let's call it 18 months. And a worst case scenario, the second location bleeds the first one dry. There's a cash crunch. You got to lay some people off. Maybe the whole thing comes apart. Now, here's the deal. When you look at the most likely scenario, it doesn't move you toward your goal. The worst case is one you actually might not survive. So in this particular case, you don't do the deal. Or you do a different version or a much smaller version of it. So same three questions here, just totally different answers. And that's what I really like about Nido's framework. It doesn't tell you necessarily what to do. It tells you what you're actually deciding. Okay, so here's the piece of all of this that I think a lot of people, a lot of entrepreneurs miss when they hear it the first time. Nido has a phrase for the way he approaches big decisions. And I think you ought to write this one down. He calls it faithful courage. He calls it faithful courage. What does that mean? He tells a story about why he left a successful business career to go run High Point University. And he says, look, I was willing to take a calculated risk and sacrifice comfort in exchange for opportunity. A key term there, calculated risk. Calculated risk is actually a fascinating phrase because those two words actually pull in opposite directions, calculated and risk. And that's the whole point. Calculated means you did the work, You ran the three questions in this scenario. You were very clear about the three outcomes to each of those questions, and you've decided that you can live with the worst case. Risk means after all of that, you still don't know how it ends. Nobody's going to call you and tell you how it's going to work out. You still have to step off the porch and go do the work. So if you're all calculated and no risk, then you never move. You stay safe forever. Nothing in your business or your life grows. And if you're all risk without calculation, you go broke. You're the entrepreneur who swings at everything and takes these big risks and is all prideful about it, but also loses big. Swings big, loses big, until eventually you're out of the game. So the job, in my opinion, is to live in both calculated and risk taking, and do that, every week, every month as an entrepreneur. So here's what I want you to work on this week. I want you to pick one decision that's sitting on your plate right now. The one that you kind of keep kicking the can on. You know the one I'm talking about. And I want you to get out a piece of paper and I want you to write the three questions across the top. Best case, most likely case, and worst case. And then answer them in writing. Not necessarily just in your head, because in your head you could kind of manipulate things and even lie to yourself. I want you to put it down on paper. It's tough to manipulate once it's down in writing. And then ask yourself the two filter questions. Does the most likely outcome move me towards my goal? And can I live with the worst case if it actually happens? If the answer is yes to both of those questions, then make the decision today. Don't carry it any longer. And if the answer to either one is no, then also make a decision today, pass on it, or restructure it until your answers change. Restructure the deal. Either way, you're making a decision. That's what we're trying to do here. That's all I have for you today. The No Days Off podcast. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, every single day brings a new opportunity to get better. So let's get after it.